Politics is tearing apart our communities and dividing our churches, and some of us are changing churches like consumers shopping based on our political preferences. This week, we're going to be talking about that, and specifically the after party, which is a small group curriculum to help us understand our political differences better and reduce tensions in our churches and our communities. We'll be talking with Travis Bond, the senior pastor of Medway Community Church in Medway, Massachusetts. Travis, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And so, Travis, for folks who don't know you or don't know Medway, can you give us a little bit about your background and Medway's?
Yeah. So name's Travis Bond. I grew up in New England. I'm a New Hampshire guy. Spent 10 years maybe out in Western PA. Accidentally fell in love with a Steelers fan. Ended up marrying her. We met at Grove City College, seminary, assistant pastor, youth pastor, and then I pastored a small church in South Carolina for about 6 years, and then back to New England. We've been here ever since, so 2010. Love New England, have a real heart for it, and the church that I get to lead is in Medway, Massachusetts. It's a fairly small town just inside the 495 belt, maybe 20 minutes north of Gillette Stadium. It's an old traditional historic church, dates back to 1750, so it's older than our country, which is a great thing I have learned for the heart of a pastor, to be reminded regularly. God didn't need you for well over 2 centuries, so I get the privilege of stewarding this church for a time, and want to do that as well as possible by the grace of God.
Or the alternative view would be, or God spent 2 centuries preparing it for you.
That is not the one I've adopted, but I appreciate the thought.
Hey, so I want to talk about the after party, but if you could just maybe lay out a problem statement for us. So what are you seeing in your context when it comes to politics, partisanship, polarization, whatever it is, that made you start looking for a solution?
Yeah, well, I suppose it probably goes back to 2020 when so many of us began to realize so many things about partisanship and discipleship. And our church, I think, like many, went through something of a winnowing process. We had a lot of folks, in kind of that ecclesiastical churn who rotated out of the church family. We had a lot of folks roll into the church, and along with the pandemic and racial unrest in the election, trying to figure out all of that. So one of the things we did as part of that was a racial unity initiative for the whole church family. That was everything from backyard book studies and discussion groups that we tried to break a large segment of the church into. We also formed a team to kind of help us think through those things. One of the gentlemen who served on that team had worked with Hasbro, and now he's with a different company. He's kind of a survey guru. And so we created this survey. We had a lot of buy-in from the church. The vast majority of our people did it. One of the questions on there asked about political affiliation. We had never asked that question before. Every pastor has a sense of where his church is at politically, but now I actually had data that showed me, I kind of thought we were a purple church politically. We really are. In fact, the data for Medway Community Church was that we are 30% identified as Republican, 30% identified as Democrat, and 40% identified as independent. So that has then informed the way that we think about politics a little bit when it comes to interfacing with discipleship. And then just kind of recovering from those hard years that we all experienced in 20 and 21. So what I did in 2022 was we preached through the book of 1 Samuel. We called it Searching for a King. I was brave enough to do that topic in a midterm election year. I didn't really want to do that in a presidential election year. But this year, one of the things we wanted to do was, before we got to just the heaviness of what we all expected to be a very difficult election, we wanted to be proactive. I don't like being reactive, and we felt very reactive back during the pandemic. And so that kind of led us to the after party.
And so were you seeing the tensions, or was it just you recognize that you've got a lot of diversity there? Because we talk about churches where people are doing stuff on social media that's not Christian. Forget about which views they had, but how they're saying it. Is it, or churches, people leaving churches, people searching out new church? Were you experiencing any of that, or was it purely that you were trying to get out ahead of it?
I think most of the real heartache and difficulty came back in 2020 and 2021. Like I said, we had some folks move out of the church. We had some folks move in. The overall health of the church by the time we got to 2023 and 2024 was quite strong, by God's grace. I mean, it's a wonderful church. And so it really led us to, okay, how do we preserve what God is doing here, knowing that we're about to face another presidential election? And the last one was really hard. One of the things in the after party curriculum they talk about is the big sort. And so it's this idea that people are now selecting friendships, sometimes careers, sometimes geographic location based on political affiliation. We had seen some of that. We actually had people move out of Massachusetts, and the primary reason they articulated was because they wanted to be in a location with a different political vibe. So all of that kind of led us to a spot where, hey, God has done some neat things in the church family. How do we protect and preserve that and advance loving one another in the midst of what 2024 is likely to be?
So you go looking for a solution. Did you have in mind what you wanted, or did you just look at stuff and the after party was the one that resonated?
Well, the after party was on my radar a little bit earlier. So we would probably go back to, yeah, it would have been, I guess, fall of 2023, where I was listening to a Good Faith podcast. I think it would have been with Curtis Chang and David French. David French is a New York Times columnist. Curtis Chang has a ministry, Redeeming Babel. I'm listening to this podcast. They're talking about, along with Russell Moore, another guy I appreciate, they're going to put together this curriculum and pilot it. And I think they did it with some pastors in Ohio. So I actually got an invitation. I registered for something, got an invitation to be part of a focus group running a few of the exercises that would ultimately become part of the curriculum. So I knew about the after party back in late 2023, was waiting for it to launch in January, and then had an opportunity to talk to our adult discipleship team about how we could plug that into our adult curriculum sometime in the spring months.
And so maybe before we I'd like to get in the meat of what the after party is, but maybe before we do that, why is it called the after party?
Yeah, it's a great name. So it's a double entendre. The after party is after political partisanship. So we're looking for a better way, and it is really looking to the great party that comes after all things, the wedding feast of the Lamb.
Yeah, because my understanding is they're not choosing sides and saying, okay, the way to resolve this is we're all going to vote Democrat, or the way to resolve it is we're all going to vote Republican, or even we're all going to not vote, right? They're really just saying there's something that transcends this that is better. Is that a fair way to think about it?
That's exactly right.
And so tell us, what is it? How does it work?
Yeah, so I can kind of sketch out the way that we utilized it. It was designed for, I think, primarily for small groups. So you're thinking of a normal, probably 8 to 12 person group in a living room, and to be utilized by, they mentioned Sunday schools a lot. So we don't have a classical Sunday school program at MCC or Medway Community Church anymore, but we do have an adult class curriculum that we run on Sunday evenings, just kind of rotate different classes. So we have some that are set, and then we also have some elective kind of one-off classes. So this one plugged into that format for us. So we ran it on Sunday evening in a large room. It was a little bit more heavily attended than some of our classes. I think there was some interest in it because of the year that we're in. So for us, just to kind of paint a picture, a large room, bunch of round tables. We had, I think, 60 people participated in the whole class. We averaged about 50 on any given night. Some people, it seemed like they sort of stuck with their table group. Many people just kind of rotated around and met different people over the course of the, I think it was 6 weeks. And it's a great class for millennials and Gen Z's learning style, which is an easy one for most Gen Xers and Boomers to utilize. But what I mean is they do a great job of breaking it up with videos and large group discussion. We didn't do a lot of that because we had a very large group. Table discussions, turn and talks, personal exercises. They have a fairly robust digital workbook, so you can do it on your laptop, on your iPad, or I printed off hard copies for our Luddites. So there was a lot of kind of different styles of learning that it touched on, and it never really dragged. I mean, we did 90 minutes every time, and it felt very full. I didn't feel like we were wasting our time. That's for sure.
Okay. And so I think you said 6 weeks.
Yeah, I believe that's right.
And so you mentioned kind of high level what folks are doing. Give us maybe a drill down on one or some examples from. So what kind of things are we doing? Are we talking about, okay, let's talk about abortion, or is it something different?
Yeah, so they set it up by talking. So week one would have been a concept called the big shift. And the big shift is this idea that as Christians, we want to move from the what to the how of politics. So their thesis is that Scripture speaks a lot less about what specific policies to hold from a political framework. The Scripture touches on some, but for the most part, Scripture tends to spend its time on teaching us how to engage with one another. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that as Christians, we want to make this shift to embracing love, the greatest commandment, let virtue inform our dialogue with one another about sometimes very hard political concepts. Mm-hmm. That was week one. It's well laid out. It resonated. And then the other kind of meta framework for the class was an XY axis of hope and humility. So in week one, you take this self-exam. I forget how many questions, but I don't know, it was 12 or 15 minutes. And then you grade yourself. And now, just like every church consultant everywhere, we've got 4 quadrants that we place ourselves in. And so in this case, those 4 quadrants were labeled combatant, cynic, exhausted, disciple. And based on your score, you plot where you land. That was revelatory for some of our people, and it definitely created some fun conversation. And then the rest of the curriculum over those 6 weeks, the next 4 classes were actually spent, each class would unpack one of those boxes of combatant, cynic, exhausted, or disciple.
And which one were you?
So I landed in the exhausted box. Okay. I would like to say I was close to the disciple box, but I wasn't there.
And so did you find an even distribution, or did you find people were weighted into one group more than others, or is that not really part of the process?
So in our group, we would have been more heavy on the exhausted side. We would have been lightest on the combatant side. And that was interesting to me because it probably spoke to a phenomenon of who registered for the class to begin with. I did not get the sense that this class was attractive to those who would be more politically extremist. Now, I want to say of my church family, it's a really good one, and we just don't have a lot of people on the far edges who want to make a thing about it. We've got it, but there's not much. Those folks were not attracted to this class. This class, most of the people who wanted to be a part of it, I think, are the folks who kind of very mainstream New England Christianity. This is exhausting. This is hard. Here we go again. I'm not sure I did a great job in 2020. Yeah. I would like to be salt and light now, but goodness, I don't always know how. Yeah. Help me. That seemed to be the vibe.
I wonder, I know there's not a step in the process this way, but I wonder if people could rate, where was I 2 or 3 or 4 years ago? And I wonder if some of our combatants have become exhausted.
And, yeah, well, it was interesting that some of our folks who, because this really was a measure, Charles, of your political thinking. So we had some, we had one woman I'm thinking of who, just a wonderful Christian character, and she registered as combatant. And so she really had to kind of unpack that a little bit. Okay, why is this showing up in this area of my life where no one would look at this individual in every day and think a combative personality?
So there's a little bit I hear in it of us understanding ourselves better, and maybe revelation of, I didn't know I was this, but also the therapeutic things where sometimes if we can put a word to something, it really helps us get our heads around what's going on here. And so not just the revelation, but I know I'm a combatant, for example, but now I've got a word that I can put against it, and I've got traits. I'm like, okay, now I get it. Now I can start to engage in what does that mean for me? Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's good. The class did a good job of asking throughout the 6 sessions introspective questions. One of the early ones, for instance, was it invited us to write down in the workbook, who are the disappeared loved ones in your life, where you have either certainty or a strong impression that their disappearance from your life is related to political difference. And so we jotted down those names and kind of prayed over them. We had one individual in the class, he spoke to me at a couple of occasions, around class 2 or 3 maybe, and then was very excited in the last class to share about this woman who had been part of his and his wife's life. And he said very inflammatory, volatile things, both online and at times in conversation several years ago related to politics. And it broke the relationship. This had been a very close relationship. He reached out to her via text. He led with an apology. He said, hey, I'm learning some things about myself, and I'm learning some things about what Jesus would have of me. She responded graciously. I think she was not without fault herself and owned that. There has been tremendous reconciliation and a reforming of that relationship that had been lost. For us, those kinds of stories, that was the win for us.
And so it sounds less about getting me to vote differently, or even necessarily, now I might vote differently and I might view an issue differently, but it sounds more about how I'm going to conduct myself as a follower of Jesus Christ when I deal with you when we disagree.
Yeah, that's right. We had another individual who, during that last class, I tried to create some time for just debrief, celebration, learnings. We had a school teacher put up her hand and talk about, I'm someone who's theologically conservative And my faith convictions often bump up against the ethos in the school where I teach. And that has placed me in a position of a lot of fear in previous years. And I'm interacting with this curriculum. I'm listening to some of the stories that the curriculum portrays, and I'm getting new tools in my tool bag for how I can talk to people about faith and not be afraid because Jesus walks with us into the workplace as much as he does the sanctuary.
Very cool. That's great. And so you can testify personally to it's had an impact on people's lives in your church.
No question. It was a really good move for us with minimal fallout. Obviously, anytime you touch on politics, it's not going to be pristine and perfect. But our church really seemed to appreciate the effort, and the tone of the curriculum is appropriate.
And so I'd love us to learn from you for churches and groups that may decide to do the after party themselves. Would you do anything differently if you were doing this again?
It went really well, and that is a good question. Yeah. We do try and debrief when we do new events and things. Charles, nothing is coming to mind when I was preparing for our time this afternoon. I did not jot down anything of, I wish we had or we could have. It just, when you put people in a room and you let them know in advance, this is what we're going to talk about. I had a lot of confidence that this would not be a problem for my church family. It would actually help create increased trust, and it went well.
And is that because you do stuff like this, maybe not about politics, but you do these kinds of events at your church and stuff like that? Or was the curriculum really helpful in how to tee it up and how to structure it and organize things? Or as a combination?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was a both and, I think. I appreciate the way that they spoke in the curriculum itself, but we also have tried to, over the years, create an ethos of we'll talk openly about hard things. We years ago, in the run up to the Obergefell Supreme Court case with the legalization of gay marriage, we spent some time on that as a church family. We put folks together in a room. I know that was dangerous. It's a little bit scary. You don't know what everyone's going to say. We didn't hand a microphone to just anyone, but there was some large group conversation. One of the things that we've tried to do around that, we've done forums on transgenderism, is we'll do like case studies, real life kind of imaginary scenarios. But if this happened, how would you process this as a Christ follower? What biblical precepts would you bring to bear? We talk about those as table groups. So I think that we've earned a little bit of trust over the years with our church family.
Mm. Is there, just as we wrap up, is there anything I've not asked you about that you think it's important for folks to hear?
Well, I think I want to say just one piece of feedback that I heard from a very small minority of the class was frustration that it lended itself to both sidesism. And I think what was meant by that was, okay, Trav, I know that side does bad stuff and that side does bad stuff, but I would have liked to hear that the other side is much worse than my side. The curriculum didn't do that. It did not give that satisfaction. And to a very small minority, that was frustrating. They wanted to know, ultimately, they were on the Lord's side.
and so you're gonna have to follow up sessions on that then.
That's right. But even that, you could see even in that God was moving, and there was heart interaction and, Lord willing, heart change. Yeah.
And I think the URL is redeemingbabel.org/the-after-party. So not the easiest one, redeemingbabel.org/the-after-party. And so if you have trouble finding them, just contact Vision New England and we'll get you connected. Travis, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Thank you for doing it and being a trailblazer, because it's a very new thing. And so thanks for doing that. And thanks for being with us today and letting us learn from you.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation, Charles.
This program is created by Vision New England, which accelerates evangelists by helping the church make disciples, do justice, and foster unity so people want to know Jesus and New England's transformed. You can find more resources at visionnewengland.org. This program is brought to you by our friends at the Palau Association, who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide.
Hi, this is Adam DePasquale, and I serve as one of the association directors of Vision New England and a lead pastor at Walnut Hill Community Church. Earlier this year on Pentecost, Vision New England hosted our first virtual 24-hour day of prayer for the region. It was an incredible success as churches and organizations from every New England state signed up to take an hour of prayer. You know, in this season of our nation and with so much happening in New England, we believe that it's time once again for the Lord's Church to gather in united prayer. So join us on Friday, October 25th for 24 hours of virtual prayer. Visit visionnewengland.org/prayer to sign your church up to host an hour and find out more information. Together we'll humble ourselves, come boldly before our Lord, and ask Him to move in a fresh way. I hope you'll join us.